I'd like to just start off by getting you to think about what happens towards the end of your day, of your typical day. You might head home, like many, on public transportation, where you probably see people checking social media on their phone or reading the news, perhaps. If you go home in a car, you might listen to music on that could be on traditional FM or AM radio, but increasingly you might be able to easily stream that through services like Spotify. If you can find ways to fit exercise into the evening, you might listen to music on your smartphone and possibly also use a fitness tracker app at the same time. Once home, you might make something to eat, maybe looking up a recipe online, and while you're doing that, you might send messages to friends or family, perhaps just to let them know you've gotten home. Then after eating and clearing up, you might watch something in the evening, perhaps together with people you live with. And again, that could be on broadcast television, but increasingly that might be through video streaming, Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Hulu, perhaps. And then as you head towards bed, you might do some reading or watch a little something before falling asleep. So you can see a pattern emerging here in the frequent use of digital devices and online services. So if any of this at all looks familiar, you're certainly not alone. Myself and colleagues have been assembling the evidence on why this matters, why it's important, what ways these digital devices and services have worked their way into our everyday lives, and what they mean to us as human beings, and what we can do about it. So why does this matter? It matters for two reasons. The first is that all this digital stuff has actually a really big footprint. And so we could look at footprint in different ways. We can think about the amount of electricity it takes to run all this stuff. That's 1/10 of electricity globally, so in total in the world, basically, which is a similar level to air conditioning around the world. We can also look at the footprint in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to global warming. So basically, sometimes phrased as carbon emissions, that's about 3% of global emissions, which is a similar level to the airline industry. The second reason that this matters is that the footprint is growing fast. Mobile phone data traffic, again, around the world, has doubled every 2 to 3 years. And we're also seeing strong growth in broadband and business internet traffic as well. So in the United Kingdom, where I live, average household broadband has gone from about 17 gigabytes per month to more than 100 gigabytes per household per month. And that's happened just in a little over 5 years, so around half a decade. So as a result, the overall electricity to power all this stuff is set to go from its current share of 1/10 or 10% of global electricity to more than 20% by 2030, and those are reasonably conservative estimates, so that's what we roughly expect to happen. So in other words, the energy for information technology, for all these digital devices and online services, is expected to double in a little over a decade. So if we go back to the comparison with the airline industry, which receives a lot of debate, should we expand this airport? What effect will that have on our national emissions targets? If the airline industry were to double or more by 2030, wouldn't that be framed as a potential problem? And shouldn't that be something that we would be actively debating? So it's exactly that sort of problem that we have for information technology now. So in order to better understand that problem, we could look at things like what all this energy goes into. So what stuff is it going into? So first we have to build the stuff, and then we have to power the devices in the home and the workplace, like laptops and televisions and mobile phone chargers. And we have to run the Wi-Fi, the broadband, and the cellular networks, and we have to power the data centers, which supply all these online services. So I guess another way of putting it is that roughly, if you flip on your television to watch Netflix, about half the energy goes into powering the television, and around half the energy goes into powering Netflix, so the network and the data center that supply that. But perhaps a more useful question to ask, and a more interesting way of thinking about it, is to think about, well, what's the internet actually for? What does it do? So in order to understand this, we can look at the amount of internet traffic globally, and what that actually serves, what services that runs. So around half of our audio and video streaming, and certainly YouTube and Netflix are leaders in this category. Around 15% are social networking and the associated advertisements and video feeds that you have with that. Around 10% are largely automatic application updates, operating system updates, and cloud backups that you might have running. So for example, if your photos are synced to the cloud, this would be part of that. And then there's everything else you might think of, web browsing, email, online gaming, and stuff like that. So my team has studied the role of these internet services in everyday life, what meaning that holds for people, and there are some key observations that I'd like to share with you, and you'll hopefully find some of these again familiar, like my beginning examples. So while many times you might actually be actively watching video streaming as it's running, it also ends up getting used to provide background noise. So this is stuff that's going on while you might be cooking, eating, talking, or simply lounging. It's similar to how television and radio have been used for decades, except now it's much easier to do because so many devices can stream, and in many cases it's as easy to get going as pulling your phone out of your pocket and starting up an app. Another thing that these devices end up doing that we've seen repeatedly is that they kind of fill time. They pass time when we're otherwise kind of not engaged with any particular. So typical examples are waiting for the bus or the train, trying to get to sleep, trying to get back to sleep, or perhaps maybe just being a bit bored. So this comes amidst observations in the news media about how much time we actually spend now on mobile devices. And in North America, that's potentially 3 hours or more per day, per person. On the positive side, I would like to point out that these devices really do have important value and meaning in our lives. It's not just for entertainment, like watching TV, as I've highlighted a few times, but it's really the interaction between people that counts as meaningful for us. So talking to each other, sharing moments through words and pictures. That's key. So what can we do about all this? Well, there are a number of things that you can do in your own household. So one is to remember the wireless router that you might have, that you probably have, in fact. So they actually consume quite a lot relative to other digital devices that you might have in the home. They only consume a little, but it adds up because they're on all the time. So in total, they actually have quite a big share of home energy for information technology. So if you're going to be gone from home for a few weeks or even a few days, you might just consider switching it off as you would a light or any other appliance that you wouldn't leave running while you're gone. In a similar vein, you might stay mindful of stuff that's just playing in the background. Is this something you're actively paying attention to or using, or is it really just some sort of noise, or are you even in the same room with it and enjoying it? And in fact, you might have noticed that increasingly many devices rely on digital services by default. So this is sort of maybe thinking about whether this is actually the most convenient or effective way to get at the content or the program. Is it something that's actually worthwhile? Using this service. Is this something you really want to engage with? And similarly, you can sort of be careful about purchases of future audio and video, electronics, and gadgets that you might think about getting. So some of these no longer include any capability to receive broadcast television or radio. They rely exclusively on online services. So those are just some small things that households can do. But at scale, there are things that technology designers, researchers like myself, and certainly big companies have a responsibility to consider. Right now, all these services are ostensibly for free, or perhaps supported by advertising, as has been raised in the media recently. Or they have all-you-can-eat plans, if you do pay a subscription, which give the impression that somehow this data traffic is all for free and there's no impact. So there's a lot we can do. This is technology designers, companies, to properly expose the energy and environmental footprint of these services. So we can think about ways to expose this. Like we could envision, for example, app stores which show ratings for different services based on how much they rely on the internet and data centers. Or similarly, we could have a video selection screen where shows and films have environmental ratings based on the data traffic that they would generate if they were watched. So these are the kinds of ratings we already see for refrigerators and other appliances that we might think about buying. Notably, Greenpeace actually rates some big companies like Facebook and Netflix for their kind of their environmental footprint, and that's worth checking out, certainly. Right now, things like social networking feeds and notifications happen in the background and all the time, but actually devices and applications usually know whether they're being actively used or not. So the easy thing is, if the screen is off, they're probably not being actively used. So one thing we could do is just make the default that no data moves if the screen is off, right? So there's no need to generate traffic if the device is not being used. A nice side effect of that would be that people who try to minimize disruptions and interruptions would appreciate the break from notifications when they're not using their device. And I think more generally, technology designers themselves often forget that data traffic has a footprint. So we should seek to minimize the number of software updates that we try to deploy, and we should look for ways to support meaningful communication, which I talked about before, using SMS or instant messaging instead of perhaps fully featured social networking with the advertisements and the video feeds that come with it. So those are some of the things that technology designers can do. But there's certainly a thing that all of us together as a society can do better, and that's to make energy part of these debates. So we already do this for other large-scale infrastructures and public services. We debate the impacts of building roads and expanding airports. We debate healthcare and how to provide that, and even things like heating and cooling regulations for buildings and how those affect the carbon emissions of the building over its lifetime. So why don't we do that for online services? A lot of times, the politics around planning data centers and high-speed broadband is focused on the local economy or access to services for people in rural areas. Both of these are really important, but it's also important to consider the footprint. So for example, if the decision is made to allow a new data center to be constructed, we might also then mandate that renewable electricity generation be built alongside that to provide power for the data center now and in the future, rather than it pulling power from the grid and thus taking power away from other parts of society, for example. And really more broadly, we should be thinking about the real value that these services provide society and whether this justifies the footprint that they leave. So we should overall remember that we are absolutely in control of how these things develop. So they needn't really continue on their current path of unquestioned growth. So we need to make energy part of the debates about digital devices and infrastructure. Thank you.